Welcome to this Tuesday's episode of Draw This. Draw This is a series of videos where I'll randomly generate a word and then draw it in real time while describing my process so that you, the viewer, can follow along. So let's go ahead and randomly generate a word, and the word that I get is apple. So in Corel Painter X3, I have a canvas. It's 16 by 12 inches at 72 dpi, but you could use any size canvas that you want. And I've created a new layer for the sketch. I'm going to use the detail oils brush and a dark gray color with a thin brush that works kind of like a pencil. And what we want to do is we want to sketch out the rough form of the apple using a primitive shape and then build it up into more of a apple-like shape. So an apple is wider at the top and skinnier at the bottom. So just kind of loosely sketch out something that is that general shape, like so. And then refine that shape. So we want to give it a little bit of character, so we'll put some lumps kind of up here to give it a little more contour. And then down at the bottom, there's that cleft down there. And then we will draw the hole in the top of the apple. It kind of curves, starts kind of horizontal, and then it curves down. That's where the stem goes, down in there. And then we'll just do a little line to kind of help us plot out where we're going to want the stem. Let's make the stem have a little bit of a kink like that. I'll make it look better. And then go ahead and sketch in around it. You want to make sure that you don't do it too thick or too thin, otherwise it won't look right. So that's something you have to kind of do by eye there. Now we have a stem. So this is our basic apple. And then as far as the contour of the apple, it might be helpful to remember when you're shading, the apple kind of comes in like this around the back. I don't know if you can see these lines I'm doing. And then the contour kind of radiates out around front. So when we're shading this, we're going to be following these contours of the apple. Kind of curves under there, and then right around here there's going to be a big light spot, a reflective spot, and the light will be coming from on the left side here. So we'll go ahead and do the outline of the apple next. We'll create a new layer for that. We'll just call this apple. Let's go ahead and just create some more layers since we're not going to have very many layers in this starting out. We'll call this one stem. We'll call this one highlight. Okay, so on the apple layer, what we will do is we will use the scratchboard tool to fill in our shape here. Let's just pick a red color. It doesn't have to be the exact color that we're going to stick with, just a color that we can see. We'll use a kind of medium-sized brush here. Well, now let's move our sketch as the topmost layer. That way we can see our sketch while we paint on the apple layer. And don't worry about getting this exactly on the line, because we can refine this line using another tool here. So just get the edge pretty close and then go ahead and fill it in with a big brush just to get it filled in. Then we will use the pinch brush, which is a distortion brush, medium-sized brush, and what you want to do is you want to paint along the line of your sketch. Basically just follow your sketch and your paint will kind of snap to that line. It takes kind of a magic touch, so you'll have to play with it, but I'm kind of painting back and forth along that line. And the longer of a stroke that you make, the smoother of a smoothing you're going to get, I guess. Takes a little bit of practice, but it works really well to refine your shapes so you don't have to spend all day erasing and redrawing. This is an additive and a subtractive tool, so it's a real time saver. Anywhere you want to make little tweaks to your apple, you can. You can hide your sketch and look at your apple and see if you like it. I'm going to play with it a little bit more. There we go. I think that's a better apple shape. And I see down here at the bottom there's a little spot that needs to be filled in. I'll fix that. And we have a good apple shape. We'll turn our sketch back on so we can see that. And then we'll go ahead and we'll put in the stem next. That can just be a dark brown color. We use the same scratchboard tool. Again, you don't have to worry about getting it perfect because you can smooth it. And we'll zoom in here because we want this to cut off at the bottom. We'll go ahead and just use the eraser for that to make the bottom edge nice and sharp there. And then we will smooth this out using the pinch brush, just like we did with the apple skin there. Just painting along my sketch. You don't have to make this super smooth because it is a stem, it can be a little jagged. And I'll go back in with my eraser again and just clean up that bottom edge there. Now, as far as this dimple in the apple, what we can do is we can just kind of imply that using another layer. We want that layer to be behind the stem, so we'll call this hole because I don't know what else to call it, and we'll make that a multiply composite method, and we will use the digital airbrush to paint in a darker area here. So go ahead and kind of fill this in, but make sure that it's darker kind of where it's deeper there where the stem connects, and then it kind of fades out and isn't as dark like so. You can hide the sketch and you can see kind of what I'm going for here. We'll blend that a little bit using diffuse blur just to smooth it out and make it a nice even transition. Use firm pressure to really blend it, and then you can use light pressure to soften it. And then we will use the pinch brush again to pinch the edge of this apple. We want to sharpen this edge here. Then it kind of fades out and isn't so sharp anymore. Kind of like that. May have to adjust the stem a little bit too. Try using the Distorto brush because you can also kind of push pixels around. There we go, I think that looks good. You'll notice that when you use these distortion brushes and you blend, you get this white fringe along the edges of your layer. If you get that, now's the time to fix that kind of stuff before you move further and do your shading. So what you can do to fix that is turn on preserve transparency, and you can use the scratchboard tool to just paint over that fringe and it'll go away. Well, let's zoom out and see how our apple looks as a whole. So this is a pretty basic looking apple. We're going to need to add some shading to it to make it look more realistic. So while we're on the stem, let's do a little work to that. Let's use the digital airbrush. We'll keep preserve transparency on, and we'll shift our color kind of towards red, take a dark reddish color like that, and we will shade the right side of the stem. This helps it to look cylindrical rather than flat. You wouldn't want it to look like a flat stem. Shade a little bit on the right side, but not very much because light, or on the left side I mean, because the light's coming from the left, so we don't want to put too much shadow over there. And a couple little dark spots here and there. And then let's switch to kind of an orangish color like that, and we'll put some of that in near the top just to kind of vary the brown. Let's take a kind of a lime color like this, throw in a little bit of that, and we'll just try throwing in another brown just to have some variety. Maybe a light brown like this with a smaller brush. Makes it look a little more reflective. And then we can take a almost white cream color, make our brush slightly bigger, and paint in some white light area. If the we're going to keep the background kind of white here, so there'd be a lot of white reflecting off of this apple since it's so shiny. Let's go ahead and make that stem just a little bit brighter. I'm kind of using little dots at this point so that it looks more textured. Put a little bit of rim highlight there on the side. And then let's go over it with some texture using the sponge. Let's take a dark brown, paint over it a couple times. You'll get less texture if you keep your opacity kind of low, so if you find it's giving you too much texture, go ahead and lower your brush opacity there. And looking at the stem, it looks a little too wide at the base, so let's turn off Preserve Transparency, and let's use the pinch brush to pinch it a little bit to thin it out. I think that looks better. And then let's zoom in so that we can see it a little bit clearer, and let's use the coarse oily blender to blend it a little bit to give it some more texture. And you'll want to use this opacity and grain setting that I have here, and I'm using this basic paper with these settings. And it's giving me this kind of effect where I'm getting a little bit of smudging and a little bit of grain, but not too much. If you zoom back out, you'll see that gives you kind of a nice effect. We can go ahead and start shading the apple now. So it doesn't need to stay this red color. We'll turn on Preserve Transparency, and we'll use the scratchboard tool to paint over it with a more realistic red. So we want something, sometimes you have to hunt with your color, maybe something like this for our base color. And then we will of course want to lighten it where it's closer to the light. So I shifted my hue a little bit towards orange while I was doing that, using a big airbrush to put in nice bright highlight there on that side. Make my color a little bit brighter. Paint in a little more highlight there. And then let's add some darkness to this, but we'll go ahead and do it on another layer. So what we will do is we will right click on the apple layer. We'll do select layer content. We'll create a new layer, and our selection goes with us to that new layer. Let's just call this dark. And we'll turn off Preserve Transparency so that we can paint on this new layer. And when we paint, it'll stay within this selection. So we'll set the composite method to multiply. That way it will tint the layer that's underneath. It's kind of like a way of changing the way that the paint works. We'll use Control-Shift-H to hide this selection while still keeping it active. And we'll shift our hue towards magenta a little more and take like a dark red like this. And for this, let's go ahead and use the square chalk, again with this same paper that we have here. We'll just put in some dark areas here and there. Vary your brush size and opacity. We'll change our red to a less dark red. Throw in a little bit of yellow orange over here. We're really just trying to vary the color. And we want to do a little bit on the back side too here. Like so. A couple real dark spots. And then we'll go ahead and blend this a little bit. Let's use the coarse oily blender. Let's turn both of these settings up, and let's use a big brush. And we want something that's streaky like this. Now be very careful not to blend from the outside of your layer in, because if you do, you might get some unexpected results. So what we want to do is we want to pull this dark color that we added to follow the contours that we established earlier. If you need help remembering what that was, you can always pull up your sketch. But this is what's going to help the apple look curved. If you don't do it like this, your apple might look kind of flat. It's the same thing with the stem. We have to do the stem in a certain way to make that not look flat. Get it all nice and blended there. And then let's add another layer. Let's call this light. These will be some light spots that we'll put in the same way. Let's go ahead and use a light red like this. Let's set our composite method to screen. Put in some light areas here. Switch it towards orange. Maybe put some orange in over on this side. And go to yellow. And here we'll put some yellow. We'll do a little bit of green too, that might look good. And we'll do some more yellow over here. Okay, now let's blend that. Now the trick is, if we're blending this light, the problem that we're going to run into is that we're going to add this white fringe when we blend, and you can see it happening here. It's adding this white where it shouldn't. So what we're going to have to do to remedy that is we're just going to merge all of these layers for the apple together, except for the stem and the whole. So go ahead and save, and you may want to save a copy. That way we can go back to the copy if we need to. I'm going to select the light layer, hold shift and select the apple, and I'm going to do Control E to merge those layers and rename it apple. So now you can see those 3 layers became 1. And now if I blend, I don't get that result that I don't like, which is the white fringe. So blending just like we did before, following those contours. This is really helping it look like an apple now. And that's always good to just zoom out and look at your piece small, because if it's looking good small, you know you're on the right track. It's also good to look at your piece in black and white, and a good way to do that is to create a new layer. We'll just call it BW for black and white. We'll set the composite method to color. You can just fill it with black using the paint bucket. And we still have our selection active. I seem to always forget this, no matter how many times I make a painting. Our selection's still active, so we can't fill our whole canvas here. So I'm going to do Control Z to undo that, and I'm going to have to do Control D to deselect that selection. And now, if I paint with my paint bucket, we can see our piece in black and white. So this helps you kind of ignore the color temporarily and focus on the value structure. And this piece is looking really flat because I got all of the colors right, but I'm not really representing the shadow on this piece overall. So what we can do is we can hide that black and white layer. Let's get a selection of the apple by right-clicking on the apple layer and choosing Select Layer Content. We'll create a new layer. We'll call this Shadow, and we will go ahead and use a dark red color like so. We'll hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, and we'll use the digital airbrush, the pretty big airbrush, and we're going to just go ahead and darken one side of this overall. We'll also need to change our composite method to multiply. That looks much better. And overall it just needs to be darker. Now it doesn't need to be super dark, and we can back that darkness down a little bit using the opacity slider. Take a even darker color and throw in a little more darkness on the side here. And I'm going to kind of go along the edges in a couple places to give it some more curvature. Painting with the edge of the brush rather than the center, and that really helps to not overpaint the line too much. Now if we turn on the black and white, you can see it's added more three-dimensionality to the apple, and it looks much better. Turn that back off, and let's blend a little bit on the apple layer. Let's use the diffuse blur, and you want to use kind of light pressure, again blending with the contours of the apple. You don't want to blend up all of this nice texture, but you can blend up some of it. Helps the apple look more smooth. You gotta have that right balance of smooth and coarse. It's something you kind of have to do based on your own personal taste. It looks pretty good. And then let's go to this highlight layer. Let's add that in. So that will be a very, very light pink starting out. We'll use the airbrush. Let's use the jitter airbrush. That might work better. Our highlight's going to be right about here. Use kind of a small airbrush. It gives you this nice mottled pattern, and that really helps to make the highlight look more natural. I'm going to switch to white. Paint over it with white. And then what we will do is we will switch the composite method to screen, and we'll paint over it with black. Let's turn on preserve transparency, and that way when we paint with black on a screen composite method, it pretty much erases or conceals those pixels. So let's start with the sponge. Tap a couple times on here. What this is doing, this is kind of breaking up that highlight, making it look like it's kind of integrated into the texture there. If you paint too much, you can always choose white again and paint back over it. I think that is looking pretty good, and I'm not so sold on the placement, so I'm going to move the highlight around a little bit until I like where it's at. That looks better to me. I'm going to zoom out and see how this looks so far. So now we need some reflections from the environment onto the apple. So we'll go ahead and create a new layer. I believe we still have a selection active if we do Control-Shift-H. No, we don't. So we will get a selection from that apple again by right-clicking and doing Select Layer Content. This new layer we will call Reflections. Control-Shift-H to hide the selection. And we will just use white because that's our environment color. What we want to do is we just want to paint in some white. This is all reflecting off of maybe this apple sitting on a table or something, and the table's white. Right along here, there's a nice highlight area. Now you can, of course, go out and buy an apple or go into your kitchen and get one. That's a good way to study and just kind of get a feel for how an apple looks depending on different lighting scenarios. Like outside it would reflect more of the sky color, inside it would reflect more of the interior color. I'm going to just add a little more light around that reflection there to help that kind of pop out, and I'm going to add a couple little spots. I think that helps. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to have a good balance of sharp and smooth edges. And also let's try moving our reflections on top of our shadows. That's always a good idea. It's always better to have the highlights on top of the shadows. So let's turn on Preserve Transparency. Let's select black. Let's change the composite method to screen. That way we can knock this back a little bit using black. So I'm going to paint over this lightly with black to kind of make this less bright. So we just want this to look like it's tinting it a little bit, not really overpowering it. That's better. Now we will use the pinch brush. We'll turn off Preserve Transparency, and then we'll use this pinch brush to sharpen some of these edges, and we'll find a nice balance of sharp and smooth. This really helps it to look more reflective. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to increase the contrast. So really just kind of paint over these highlights that you put in. See how it really sharpens it there? It's going to make it look more like a reflection if you do it right. And you can also use the Distorto to push and pull if you want to. See how you get that nice kind of reflective feel now. And then of course we can also add masks to this reflections layer. A mask is another good way to conceal. We'll paint with black using the airbrush. I'm just going to kind of fade this a little bit more and zoom out. See how we're looking. We can also turn down the opacity. So I want this to be subtle. Let's add a little bit of reflections to the stem. So we'll click out of the mask by clicking on the little icon that's to the left of the mask. And we'll do Control D to deselect. We'll go to the highlight layer and we'll add it to that layer. So I'm just going to go pretty heavy with the white here, knowing that I can go ahead and back it down a little bit if I need to. And I'm going to add a mask to that highlight layer. Select black. Let's try the chalk. Let's see what kind of result we get there. As long as it's kind of breaking up that highlight, then that's the effect that we want. And then let's add some little speckles, some little dots on this apple. So let's do a selection of the apple layer again by right-clicking and doing select layer content. Hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, and we want to be right between the shadow and the apple layer, so we'll create a new layer there, and we'll call this Specs. This will be a screen composite method. Then we'll choose kind of a yellow-orange peach color, maybe something like this. And we'll go ahead and use the pepper spray brush for this. You'll want to set your flow pretty low to 1. And then using your brush isn't always the best option. Sometimes it's better just to click with your mouse. That way you don't get so many dots. So just do some clicks. You might have to play with your feature size to get that to the right feature. I'm going to reduce mine to 7. That controls the size of the dots. And you just want to kind of pepper some all over it here. Do a lot at the bottom and then less at the top. To get a more natural effect, you can change the feature size smaller if you want. I'm going to go to 4. Add some finer dots. Add some up here near the top too. And let's turn on preserve transparency. We'll take the digital airbrush. We'll switch our color to kind of a light pink here. And let's paint over some of these specks and make them pink so that they're not all the same color. Switch to yellow and we'll do some of them yellow. Now we have a little bit of variety here in our color. And then let's blend a little bit. Let's turn off preserve transparency. Let's use the diffuse blur, and again we want to lightly blur following the contours that we already established, because if you blend against them it's not going to look right. Just lightly blend though, you don't want to destroy those dots. And then let's turn down the opacity of that layer to get a better blend for the dots. And we'll zoom out, see how we're looking. Let's add another layer and move that below the stem, which let's go below that whole layer. And let's call this texture. We'll set the composite method to multiply as we usually do for texture. Take a dark red color. We'll use the sponge. And we'll paint over the apple and give it some texture. And reduce the opacity until we find a nice blend. And let's add some more texture to the stem as well. We'll create a new layer, we'll right click on the stem, do select layer content, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, name that new layer stem shadow, and we'll make the composite method multiply. We'll use that, let's use a darker brown. We really want this texture to stand out here. And if you go too heavy, you can always erase some of it using white. Let's use the chalk to just mask out some of it here and there. So we just get a little bit. And I'm going to zoom out and evaluate the apple. I think that's looking pretty darn good. See a couple spots where it looks a little flat on the edges, and I'm going to enhance that. So I'm going to get a selection of the apple again. I'm going to go to the reflections layer, and then I'm going to add a layer above that. I'm just going to call this edge. It's these little finishing touches that really bring the piece together, and sometimes you have to kind of look and see where you haven't put as much effort in as other places. I'm going to do Control-Shift-H to hide the edges, and let's use white again. I'm just going to enhance this edge down here. And then maybe have a highlight that kind of wraps around the apple like so. And I'm going to use the Distorto to kind of sharpen that a little bit. And then I'm going to go to the reflections layer, go to the mask, select black, select the digital airbrush, and I'm going to mask away some of this I think that'll help it look a little more natural, because something about this bottom area was not looking right to me. And I'm going to go to that edge layer I just created. I'm going to just use the eraser. It's rare that I use the eraser, I know. I'm going to erase a little bit of that edge there. I think on this edge layer that can be a little bit lighter too. Let's evaluate this in black and white. I think it looks pretty darn good in black and white and in color. We don't need the sketch layer anymore. We can delete that. We can group all of these apple layers into a group called a group apple. Then we can, oops, I went ahead and messed it up here. Do some Control Z. So we still have the selection active, so we'll need to do Control D to deselect. And now we can move our apple. And the good thing is we could take this and we can put it in another composition too if we wanted. Could, you know, hide the background and save this as a file and then import it into another composition. You could also change the color of the apple if you wanted to a green apple, and we'll just take a look at how to do that because we still have a little bit more time. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to keep everything together on the same layer except for the stem and the hole. This highlight, I think we can make an exception for that too. So what we'll do is we'll grab texture all the way down through apple using shift, and we'll do Control E to merge those layers. We'll call this apple. If you're worried about losing your layers or anything, you can always save a copy of your artwork before you do any merging. And on this apple layer, I'm going to go to Effects and Tonal Control and Adjust Colors. And then I'm going to change the hue. So I can make a golden apple, I can make a green apple. It might take a little finessing because of course this green isn't really a very natural green, but it gives you an idea of how you can kind of tweak things. Like if your red was off for some reason, you wanted to make it more pink or less pink, you can just really tweak that. Same thing with your saturation. If it's too dull, you can pump up the saturation. If it's too bright, you can reduce it a little bit. Sometimes I have a habit of doing things too bright. I'm going to go to OK. All right, now there's a couple more things that we can do to bring this all together and make a finished painting. Let's go to the highlight layer. Let's go ahead and right click on the mask icon and go to Apply Layer Mask. And let's blend that a little bit using Diffuse Blur, just lightly, like so it's not so sharp. And then let's go ahead and just merge all of the apple layers. So click on the group name there and just do Control G to merge them. Now we have the apple on its own. And these edges don't look so good sharp, so what we want to do is we want to blur the edges a little bit using the blur brush. And this kind of gives a sense of focal distance, so the edges that are moving away from you in space should be a little bit blurrier. And we want the stem to kind of stick out in front of the background of the apple. So let's blend the background of the apple first. Don't want to blur it too much, so you may want to turn down this opacity of this brush so that you get a more subtle effect. You can blend the stem a little bit. You want to just really try to blend all the edges a little bit, but more so in the background, behind the stem, and then less on the rest of the edges. So I'm just going to do a little bit back and forth along the edge. This kind of makes it look more natural. If you take a picture of an apple, the edges aren't super sharp naturally. And now if we zoom out, we have a finished apple. So if you enjoyed this lesson of Draw This, you can join me every Tuesday for another new episode. Take a quick second to like this video and share it on YouTube or on Facebook, and that'll make it easier for other artists to find this information. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so that you can see my new videos as they're released. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.